Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today we're going to be talking about our friend, the Sega 32X. Yes, not our frenemy, our friend. And specifically the fact that this thing is 30 years old. Yeah, I know, right? What we're going to do is go down memory lane, we're going to talk a bit about it, we're going to talk some history, my story with it, that type of thing, and just kind of somewhat of the resurgence the Sega 32X has oddly enough had. I'll just kind of leave that there awkwardly as it can't sit properly. Before we do that though, if you guys could do me a favor, please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, as well as check out all my social media stuff in the description. I've got Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, my Spreadshirt, travel channel. I appreciate the support on all those platforms. Thank you so much. Let's get into it. So, yeah, if you are watching this the day it came out, it is November 21st, 2024, which means it is exactly the 30th anniversary of the release of this machine in North America, which was the initial launch of the entire system. Also, if you're keenly aware of your dates, you will also know today happens, if you're again watching the day it came out, also happens to be the 20th anniversary of the Nintendo DS. Where's the video on that, Adam? What's with the Sega bias? I released that video yesterday. Go watch it. It was the only way this was going to work. You couldn't have two in the same day. Sorry. But anyway, that video exists. Go check that out too. So for this one, though, this is obviously not my recap video. I've done that video. But I felt that it would be kind of important to just go down and talk about the 32X again, because it's just kind of how often you're going to get that kind of opportunity. I guess in 2034, when we do the 40th anniversary, and I'm all white hair. But other than that, I thought it'd be kind of fun to talk about it. So, here's basically an elevator pitch of the history that got us into the Sega 32X. If you're unfamiliar, the 32X was effectively an upgrade for the Sega Genesis, kind of pitched as the next generation, the 5th generation Sega hardware, and then was kind of just phased out and is often remembered as this atomic bomb-like nuclear explosion, this mushroom cloud that sits over the legacy of the Sega Genesis. Well, kind of a fair assessment, it's also kind of not, so I thought it would be kind of fun to dive back in now that we have an excuse to. So, the history of it basically is you have to understand at the time in the 90s, despite their high success, particularly with the Sega Genesis in North America and Mega Drive in Europe, it was a kind of an unsuccessful system in Japan, referring to the Mega Drive. And Sega, being a Japanese company, was kind of embarrassed by that because Japanese are very prideful and they wanted their system to do well in their mother country. But they also understood economic reality, which was all the money they were getting was coming from outside of the country. So they were faced with an odd situation. What do we do in the 5th generation of game consoles? Do we cater to the Americans and the Europeans, or do we focus more on this is Japan and we should focus on Japan? They focused on that. So that's how you end up getting the Sega Saturn, which, fun fact, you're getting a video about that tomorrow, so stay tuned. Unless this is way in the future and the video already came out and you get how timelines work. Anyway, so what Sega of Japan ends up doing is they say, okay, we don't want to lose all the market share that we have in North America. We understand that that's really important. That's where our bread and butter is. That's where the money's coming in. So we need to make something the Americans will like. We also, and this is real, the president of Sega of Japan at the time saw ads for the Atari Jaguar, and it's being 64-bit, do the math, that whole thing. And he looks at that and goes like, uh-oh, that could crush the 16-bit Genesis. The Bit Wars was at their height of, infamy then. And he was terrified of Atari basically taking Sega's market share while they figured out what they were going to do. So he basically says, you need to do something. In North America, you need to do something. And he tells them basically to build the 32X. Like, you need this upgrade thing for your system. Apparently, Sega of America, according to Tom Kalinske, was very much like, that's not a good idea. Like, we have to be on the same page here. But it's the way Japanese companies are. They just overrode him and said, no, you have to do it. So this was actually designed by Sega of America against their will. And it is referred to as Project Mars. I know you guys know because I do videos on the Sega Pluto and stuff. They had this obsession with planets. If you take a 32X apart, you will actually see the word Mars written on the motherboard. And so it wasn't, here's the thing. The way we look back on it now, it seems like a terrible idea, because it was. But if you look at it in the moment, through that very finite lens of time in which it was meant to exist, it wasn't actually the worst idea. Imagine a world where they never released the Sega Saturn, which would obviously have sucked. I prefer the Saturn, obviously. But if I were to tell you, like, hey man, the next generation of consoles is coming, the N64, the PS1, etc., the PS1's $299, N64 is $399 or whatever it was, or maybe it was $299, I honestly don't remember. But what if I told you, hey, this, remember how you have a Sega Genesis just laying around? You can upgrade to Sega's next 5th gen system for only $150. You just attach it, and like that's it. You have the next generation hardware. That sounds kind of appealing and very prosumer. It'd be like if when Sony released the PS5, instead of doing that, they said, hey, you know how you have a PS4? We're just releasing this little attachment. You put the USB cable in your PS4. It costs, $200, and that's it. You have a PS5 now. The whole thing, all the hardware it needs is in there. That would have been very appealing to a lot of people, assuming they stuck with it. That's the issue. So basically, Sega of Japan forces them to release this thing, and this is why this is the stupidest thing ever. So this thing eventually, despite how much I want to like it within the just bubble it exists, its own pocket dimension, as it were, Sega Overlord Corporate clearly didn't plan that very well, because here's the thing. This was released, as I said, on November 21st, 1994. November 22nd, 1994, the Sega Saturn comes out in Japan. So guess what video we're talking about tomorrow. But because of how time zones work, that's the same day. That is not organized. So naturally, what ends up happening is, funny enough, the 32X was actually kind of a big hit in North America initially. For that exact reason. People thought, wow, this is Sega's next generation system. It's already here. And it works with the system I already have. I just do a cheap upgrade and boom, I have the next. It actually fit. Meanwhile, the system isn't coming out in Japan. It does eventually. It comes out in Europe eventually. And while we have it in North America, and that's clearly where their focus was, the rumors were starting to get out there. Like, you got to remember, this is before the internet, really. This is before smartphones, before Google, all that. So the only way we heard about the Sega Saturn was like through magazines and stuff. And like, dude, my cousin went to Japan and they have like a totally different Sega machine over there. What's up with that? Like, that's the kind of stuff. That's the only way that information got out. And of course, then the big E3 1995. After that is, of course, when Sega of North America announces and even releases the Sega Saturn. And you're just like, well, what the hell? What's this thing all about? What are we doing with that? So that obviously burned a lot of customers, and everybody knows that story. But yeah, basically Sega of Japan eventually tells Sega of America to get rid of the 32X and cut it off, which was just the American division being like, that's very, very definitively Japanese. When they have control of an American group, they basically will like limit them on the tools and then blame them for their failure. It's a very common practice, and a lot of people who work in Japan that are gaijin will tell you that. But that's a whole different matter. So that's, in short, the history. Now, because Sega was nuts with different amounts of hardware throughout that era, there's a lot of different compatibility issues and things like that with the 32X. Like, it's designed mostly for the Model 2, which is what you have here. It does work on the Model 1. There's a spacer here that allows it to fit properly on the Model 2. It doesn't need that for the Model 1. It doesn't work on the Model 3. Doesn't work on the Laser Active, etc. What you see here is the Sega CDX. This is funny, actually, because I did a video on this. On the history of the CDX when I did a video there. On the box of the CDX, they refer to it as not being 32X compatible. Or is it the box of the 32X refers to it not being CDX compatible? I don't remember which. But basically on the boxes, they say it's not compatible. But within the manual, it says that it is. And the reason the manual says that is because Sega had intended to release a plastic spacer, like the one you see right here, that would mount it properly. The thing is, from a hardware level, it totally works. It's just that it's loose when it's just sitting there, and they consider that unsafe, and therefore it's easier to call it unsupported because they didn't want to release a specific piece of plastic to have a dead add-on for a low-selling, variant of the system, so they just axed it. The reason I have one is this was, like I said in the video, this was actually 3D printed by a guy. He sent this to me and just to throw it into a video, so there it is. But that's kind of where the 32X is at now. There's actually a little bit of retroactive love for this thing, a little bit more appreciation for what you want to believe Sega was doing, which is this prosumer upgrade. But in reality, we know that's not really what they were trying to do. They would have had to have stuck with that indefinitely, but that would have been a bad idea too, because then you would have had Sega competing with themselves, two different 5th gen hardware, like radically different too. You couldn't be like sitting there developing games for the Saturn in Japan and then spend the time converting them to 32X compatibility. That just wasn't going to work. So obviously, even though I think the 32X is fun and neat and weird, it should never have been released. Like, I'll freely admit that should never have happened. That said, as I said, Sega loved to do their variants. There is also the Sega Neptune. I have actually done a video on it. There's only one real one. It's at the National Video Game Museum in Frisco, Texas. It's a criminally underviewed video, so I hope you guys check it out at some point. I had private access to it to check it out, but it's just a resin mock-up. It doesn't do anything. But the idea was that it was a 32X Genesis all-in-one unit. And I've seen a lot of people say that's what they should have released instead. I completely disagree. That would have been even worse, because that thing probably would have retailed for the full 300 like a Saturn would have, and would have had just as limited support. At least this thing was half off. Effectively, and your Genesis still worked without it. You know what I mean? Like, the Neptune also should not have existed, and they correctly made that decision. Ironically, it kind of exists now because, and I don't have mine yet, but nowadays there's actually a way to make your own 32X. There's these resin-based shells, as well as if you have like the right model of the Genesis and you have sacrificial 32X, you can kind of do a lot of soldering and put them together. A buddy of mine named George is actually building one for me. I don't have it yet, but here's just some like B-roll footage of one of them in operation. They're pretty neat. They do work completely, and they look really sweet alongside of a Model 2 Sega CD, which is what I have here. But unfortunately, don't have mine yet. So that would have been nice for the video, but sorry. Now that we have that, or we're talking about that, let's talk about some games. Because, yeah, why not? So, my story with it, actually, before we get to the games, you need to understand my personal story. That's the history stuff. My personal story with it, I've told this before, so we'll kind of do it short, but I actually had a friend, like one of my childhood, like, you know, hey, we met on the playground when we were like 3 type of friend, and we were friends throughout, you know, middle school till he moved. But, you know, I used to go to his house a lot, and we'd play Sega Genesis and all this other stuff. But one day, I come over, and he's got the 32X. You know, I know I've told this story, but again, it's just, to me, it was insane to actually see someone who had it and have memories of that. He gets the 32X, his dad had got it for him, and they had a couple of the, you know, they had 3 of the games, which we have here. And I remember actively, like, he's trying to get all hyped about it, he's all excited about it, and I'm sitting there going like, I don't know. Like, I wasn't, even as a kid, I wasn't really sold on it. And then later, in 95, I remember going to, it was with my mom, and she suddenly had this, like, she was, like, willing to get me a new system. I want to say it was a Toys R Us, and it was definitely 95, because the PS1 was already out. So it had to be past September of 95, because that's when it launched. So it was probably, like, November of 95, something like that. By that point, 32X was a clearance item, so they were like $50 for the system. And I remember going in there, and I actually went in there, if I recall correctly, with the intention of getting the PS1. And because my cousins had a PS1, and I thought that thing was really cool. But we get there, and she sees the 32X, and she's like, look, you know, this is up to you, obviously, but if you want, you can get the PS1, and you just have to play the demo disc or whatever that comes with it, or, you know, all the 32X stuff was on sale. So it was like you could get the system, plus you could get like a bunch of games for all the same amount of money. And there was this brief time where I sat there in Toys R Us being like, maybe it makes more sense to get this thing. Keep in mind, and I know this is strange, I had never heard of the Sega Saturn. Even at that point, even after the Saturn had been out for effectively 6 months in the US, over a year in the world, I had never heard of it. It says something. But I'm looking at all these games thinking, like, this must be what Sega's future is. That's what I thought as a child. I didn't know any better. And I almost pulled the trigger, and I'm just going to be honest, I'm glad I didn't. Obviously, the PS1 was the correct choice, but I could have ended up with a giant stack of games, and I could have been that one kid with the 32X, only to find out, like, a few weeks later, like, yeah, dude, they're not making any more games. That thing's over. That would have been awful, and I wouldn't have had a PS1. It would have been totally different. So, as a child, I made the right choice. But that's the extent of my story with it as a kid. So let's talk about some of the games. First and most obvious, by the way, this is not all my games for the system, just a couple of highlights where I have something, one thing or another to say about it, okay? So if you have a favorite game that's not here, I apologize, but like you can't do every single game. So Virtua Fighter, this one I don't have in the original case, but Virtua Fighter is probably the most associated game with the system, simply because it came bundled with a lot of variants of it. And here's the thing, I didn't like it. Like, this is one of those 3 games my friend had, and I remember it was obviously all polygon based, and it was too polygonal, if that's the right word choice. I just remember thinking it was too even then, as a kid, I thought it was too rudimentary, too crude, and just didn't play very well. I love Yu Suzuki. I've met the man multiple times. I love Shenmue. It's my favorite game of all time. And this is sort of the precursor to it, and I didn't enjoy it. That's just me. Another one that he had, which we probably spent the most time playing together, was Star Wars Arcade. This was in a weird phase before the Star Wars special editions had come out, obviously before the prequels, very much before the Disney era. So like this, if you liked Star Wars stuff, this was the only way to get new Star Wars experiences, was this type of game, because it was new content. And effectively you were just playing scenes from the movie, but in polygonal, again, I'm gonna use that word even though it might not really be a word, in polygonal adventure. Polymegonal? I don't know. Anyway, so like, yeah, we played a lot of this, and even then I was like, it was just not that fun. that was the thing. This felt like one of those games where you were trying to convince yourself you were having fun, because I like it because I'm in a shooter thing. It's a new video game. It looks so cool. Look, there's Darth Vader. He's awesome. But I wasn't actually having fun with it. That's how I remember that. Virtua Racing, though, I didn't like this game at all. And this was sort of, in a weird way, part of what inspired the 32X, because the Genesis version of this game more or less had some semi-32X hardware in it that it could work with the Genesis, but they had this mindset that if they sold you this, then they could make games specifically for it. It'd be cheaper to produce, whatever. That's just part of its history. It's not really important, but they decided once they had this out there to make an upgraded version of Virtua Racer. Same deal, man. It was just too crude looking. My friend did legitimately love this game, though. He loved racing games, played them all the time, and this was like, anytime I was going there, he was just crushing it on this game. He just loved playing it. So he got a lot of happiness out of it, so I certainly can't knock that. Now, these I don't have childhood stories with, but I do have something to say on each one. This one was, for years, the game that people believed they wanted a 32X for. Same with me. Once I finally had one on my own, I was like, this is the game I need to get, because this is the experience I've never had, and I got to do this. Knuckles Chaotix. Knuckles Chaotix is the only sorta Sonic game on the 32X. Sonic, I don't know if he ever appears in it. If he does, it's just a cameo. Metal Sonic's in it. But obviously Knuckles at that point was, it was the mid-90s. It was shortly after Sonic and Knuckles and everything. It was like the height of the Tood era, Attitude. And it's just, I wanted this game because I loved the Sega Genesis game so much, and I was genuinely curious what the 32X could do. When you see footage of this game or screenshots of this game, it looks great. It actually looks like a big fun adventure. And, hilariously, this game still lives and dies on this platform. Sega has never reissued this officially in any capacity. Obviously, you can play the ROM on different things, but they've never put it in any sort of official collection or anything like that. It's still exclusive to the 32X. A Sonic game, sort of Sonic game. But the thing is, the game itself is not actually very good, which is depressing. It's like you couldn't even get that right. So it has this weird element where you have two players at once, and they're kind of rope attached to each other with rings. I didn't like that element of it. I've always wanted to. I occasionally revisit it, and I'm like, I'm going to like it this time. And I just don't. It's not the worst, but it's just unfortunate. Oh well. As I mentioned, the system did come out in Europe. They had 2 exclusive games over there. I have one of them, which is FIFA Soccer 96. That's not a game I actually particularly care about. It's just the fact that this game was only issued on the 32X in Europe. So that's the reason I have it. But annoyingly, the 32X is also region locked. Why? It's do you think we're dying to get down to play FIFA 96? No, but there it is. There was another one that's effectively impossible to have. However, it has been reproed, and that's what this is. Darkside. Darkside is a weird shooting, flying game, kind of like a poor man's Star Fox 64 almost. It's not a terrible game. It's not a great game. But what's interesting about it, and this is just point I was trying to make, is that the fan scene, if you will, the nostalgia for the 32X, it's time. I'm not going to say it's come again, but it's getting a little bit more respect. So people are trying to find ways to chip away at its library and say, like, what else can we do to improve it? This, at least from a North American perspective, was the best game on the 32X that was not released here. There was only 3 that weren't. 2 in Europe and 1 in Japan. The Japanese one I don't even have. It's Romance of the Three Kingdoms, something or other, like one of those games. And so this game, though, is the most playable and most interesting of the 3. And so this is a repro card. Excuse me, that bypasses the region coding issue. They got rid of that. And they also fixed the frame rate because this game ran at 50 hertz. They got it running at 60 hertz. And so now it just runs. This version I have is actually put on a 32X card. Most 32X repros are actually put on Genesis cards because they're cheaper. I actually specifically picked this one up because the guy who made it actually used real 32X cards, which I thought was just, you know, more to the point. There are actually other repro games on the 32X now because there's been other games that were dumped, incomplete ones. Like there's 7-Up used to have a character called Spot. Spot Goes to Hollywood was released on the Genesis, the Saturn. There was a 32X version, but it was never finished. The ROM of that was dumped online, so you can make repros. There's other little bits in there. Some people are also doing ways to try and utilize the 32X to get more out of the Genesis. Like, it's a whole thing. But speaking of that, we have, of course, it must be said, it is a system, so can it run Doom? Yes, it can. It is a variant of Doom. This is actually one of the easier versions of Doom to get. If I recall correctly, there is an issue with this version. I think that it had the better music. I don't remember. Like, you have to understand, Doom came out on everything because that's the law. But each version from that era was slightly different. Like, I think the Jaguar version played the best but had no music. Whereas, like, the Super Nintendo version had good music but didn't play very well. And this was kind of like a happy median, if I recall correctly. Honestly, I don't really remember. But that is there. We're going to come back to that in a second. Also, because it had technically the option to link up with the Sega CD, which is what you see here, there was actually one company called Digital Pictures that made 6 games for it. This is Corpse Killer. So this took the idea of combining all of them, and Sega only gave this one name ever officially, and it was very just off the cuff. They referred to it as The Machine. They never gave the combo or Tower of Power, which is now more of what it's called, an official name at the time. This game utilized the power of all 3, which is interesting, but it's not really a game. These are all like FMV stuff, so basically it was just the Sega CD game, but it used the additional color palette of the 32X to have like a better visual experience. That's about all these ever did. There were 5 released of these in North America, and then there was one only released in Brazil called Surgical Strike. Which only recently got a reissue because somebody, like, it's a super rare game, like the original version, so much so that people weren't sure it even really existed. But the repro, somebody was able to find an original copy of the game, dumped it, and then said, let's make repros. I have one of the repros. Even the repro now is rare because they only did like 100 copies of it. But whatever, got that. Now, why do I'm going to go back to Doom here. There is now, as I said, there is this idea that maybe we can do something with this. There's a little more love for the 32X. So there's actually a new remake of Doom. I think it's called Doom Resurrection, that actually utilizes the power of all 3. So I think it's a Sega CD build that uses obviously the Genesis and 32X capabilities to be like the definitive edition of Doom on this hardware, because of course it has to be Doom. Again, it is the law. So I'm very curious. That, as far as I know, is not out yet, but I'll be very curious to see how that runs. But I've talked to certain people, like there's a guy in my Discord, shout out to his name is TechRise. He's been working on trying to get like a combo game as well. Now we have a generation of people that kind of grew up on this and are now challenged by the idea of making something that utilizes the power of all 3, which was never really done properly. What could that turn out to be like? Maybe one day we'll see. And the last game I want to show you, just because it's in front of me and I actually have it, SpiderMan Web of Fire. This is a game that has shot up astronomically in price. I believe it's because it was the last 32X game ever issued. Comically rare. Not a whole lot of copies of this were actually sold or released anywhere. It just barely came out at all. And I got this years ago for my 32X recap video. And I bought it for that video. And it's a terrible game. I bought it at the time for $200 thinking I'm an idiot, but whatever, I'm going to do this. Wow, was I right to do that, because the game has shot up like massively, especially a box complete, nice condition copy like this. So happy that I actually did that. But yeah, so that is the Sega 32X. Now, who out there actually has one? Who out there actually wants to celebrate its 30th birthday? Who's going to go out there and play it? I want to know. Tell me some stories. Who's got anything to say on it? I'm genuinely curious. Like I said, the 32X is misunderstood. From its hardware perspective, it's actually not bad. What it could do is kind of cool. It's just the marketing around it and the fact that it had to compete with itself as far as like Sega, meaning the Saturn, is just... like, all those circumstances are what really hurt it. But if you look at a different timeline, where Sega says, no, our next generation console is going to be this attachment. It's going to be very prosumer. It's going to be much cheaper than our competition, and we're definitely going to support it. And all those Saturn experiences we would have otherwise had ended up on the 32X instead. Then you would have had Genesis backwards compatibility, and then hypothetically, if you had a Sega CD, they could have made content that works with all three. That timeline is more interesting. But without committing to it, yeah, the 32X shouldn't have been released. But, you know, it is what it is. So I'm curious, what do you guys have to say? If you guys do me a favor, not only leave those comments, but do leave a comment, subscribe, like if you've never done that. Well, obviously like it first, then subscribe if you've never done that. And check out all my social media stuff in the description. I've got Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, and my travel channel. I appreciate the support on those platforms. Happy 30th birthday to the Sega 32X, and technically 20th birthday to the Nintendo DS. And stay tuned to tomorrow, when I already gave it away, we're going to be talking about the 30th anniversary of the Sega Saturn, which would also sort of technically be today anyway. It's a weird day, isn't it? But anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.